So welcome back to the recording after the org slides. Now lecture 1, the first one with actual content. Once again, the short disclaimer that all of the stuff that we're doing here is open source. And now let's dive into the actual first lecture. So this is, theoretically you would probably call it a motivation lecture to motivate you to be interested in the topic that we're talking about. Usually I get the feedback that this session is rather demotivating and depressing, but it still serves pretty much the same purpose, like it should entice you and make you curious on how to deal with those problems, or it's maybe actually like one bigger problem that is quite simple to summarize in one sentence, that we're essentially only having one planet and that we are ruining it. Sounds like a very lame and stupid and simple statement, but has many very unfortunate and inconvenient implications that we'll go through now a little bit one by one. Of course, not covering all of them, but we're trying to categorize them later into 3 major categories of problems that we'll tackle in this lecture series in more detail. Let's start with a problem that is potentially known to most of you because it's related to climate change, or more precisely to one of the main drivers of climate change, which are so-called greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 emissions, where CO2 is one of those greenhouse gases. We'll talk about like definitions and the exact things like what those are in the subsequent lecture sessions, but right now the background that greenhouse gases, and CO2 is one greenhouse gas being released into the atmosphere, are causing global warming, our planet to heat up. The more greenhouse gases you release, the warmer it gets. In order to prevent us from being baked, we would like to minimize those greenhouse gas emissions. And what you have here now in this illustration is on the left side, on the y-axis, the greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons. And on the right side, or on the x-axis, you have a time frame from 2000 to 2100, and then you have differently colored graphs provided here. The one at the bottom shows us the amount of greenhouse gases that or like how greenhouse gas emission has to develop so that we can still keep global warming to 1.5 degree. So this figure is, I think, from 2019, sorry. So we have knowledge of how many greenhouse gases we emitted at this point in time, and everything afterwards is a projection. So this is where we were in 2019, around 50 gigatons that we emitted every year. And in order to make 1.5 degree, we would have to go down this path. So a drastic decrease to just get there. So for everyone who followed the news, 1.5 degree is that no matter what we do, we will not get to 1.5 degree. Not only because the sudden heavy decrease was unrealistic in the first place, because like we're trying to do something against global warming and climate change for a while now, and only those minor stagnant changes were the result, while like the overall emissions still increased. But also because we had way too little time at this point where this graph was produced to do anything at all anymore. 2 degrees looks slightly better, but not really more realistic. So we have not crossed 2 degrees now, so it's not 2 degrees is dead as well, but 1.5 is definitely not achievable anymore by the majorities of projections that you can get, because we cannot just go that drastically down with those emissions as far. You might also see that it's not just about decreasing them, but it's actually about getting them to 0, so that we are not emitting any greenhouse gases, mainly CO2, at all. So it means we have to find ways to make your car drive without emitting any further greenhouse gas emissions into the environment. So it's not just about making it less, it is about getting them to zero. And to some extent, also removing emissions from the atmosphere that have been emitted before. That's a different story, we'll get back to that, but that's a different discussion. Now we have a few more lines there. The Paris pledges might be a familiar term. There was quite a while ago a quite big climate conference in Paris, the Paris Climate Conference, or which essentially then resulted in this Paris Agreement, where a lot of countries made a lot of promises, and it was celebrated as one of the great achievements when it comes to protecting the climate. Most of the countries later pulled out and said, yeah, we're not gonna care about that anymore. Even those who stayed in did not even get close to hitting their goals, which is a problem in itself. But as you can also see, while they stated in the Paris Agreement that they want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, what they promised there gives us 2.5 to 2.8 degrees, and they're not even keeping that. So right now, we're somewhere in the 2.8 to 3.2 degrees area. So this red-orange part there. So we were claiming to go for 1.5, but we're actually going to 2.8, 3.2 this far. Those are the bad news. The good news is it's still much better than not doing anything at all, because that will lead us to something between 4 and 5 degrees. So there is some kind of a positive news in here. Anyway, so even though I'm like trying to make this slightly entertaining, this is a serious problem. Like 1.5 was like considered one of these, like we have to keep this, and now we're heading for 3 degrees. So this is a major problem. How that's going to be a problem, that will be part of the later slides. Okay, now I forgot a question. Yeah, we could have made this an interactive session, but I now messed up this opportunity. So 1.5 was essentially the lower threshold. Like 1.5 is not going away, because reversing global warming and making the Earth cooler again, our planet cooler, is not an option that we can achieve in our lifetime, and it's very debatable whether this is an option at all, that you can really cool down the planet again in a substantial way that you can measure it. So the question is, how high can you go? Is it 2 degrees the maximum where we have problems in society? Is it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10? Like if it's 10 degrees, why should we bother? Why should we even care about 2 or 3 degrees if it's 10? But the upper threshold is unfortunately not 10. The main problem here, and this is the disclaimer with this statement now, it's really difficult to get any proper numbers of what the upper limit actually is, because it's a super complex system with a lot of interrelated problems and loops and processes that tie into each other. So it's very, 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 very difficult to make a proper statement whether 2 degrees is a problem, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, like where is the end of the line, and what does end of the line mean? Does it mean we only have 1 billion dead people? Does it mean extinction, that every single person on this planet dies? Like that makes it even more difficult to give you a proper line. So there's very little clear research and where this upper line, this upper threshold is. Some researchers making some estimates to the best of their judgment where this threshold is. Michael Mann from, if I'm not mistaken, Penn State University was like once asked where he would think that this upper limit is, and he projected or estimated that everything above 3 degrees is where civilization as we know it would probably crumble and fall apart. We should hopefully get it below 2.7 to avoid the greatest hardship and still have something worth living. So please don't cite this as a fact that is indisputable. This is an estimate that is available. Briefly going back to the previous slide, so he said 3 degrees, civilization might crumble, 2.7 to just avoid the biggest hardship. Right now we're going to 2.8 to 3.2, which is not really a great projection. What are some of those side effects that climate change brings to us or causes or is somehow impacted by climate change. And I try to not just bring examples now from far away continents where you're just like, yeah, it's unfortunate that other people have those problems. Most of those examples are actually from Germany or just around the corner, even from the Harz region. So this is the famous Ahrtal thing where we had this massive flood event after extreme rain events where something like 200 people died, if I'm not mistaken. And this is one really nice example of the side effects of a warming climate. It's a tendency towards extreme weather events. That could be extended droughts, so long dry spells without rain. It can also be now suddenly having the rain of a whole year or of a whole month raining down onto a specific area in just a matter of hours. It can also be extremely high temperatures for a longer time or for a short period, followed by very low temperatures, or any kind of those combinations. The term global warming indicates, yeah, it's just getting a little bit warmer, and what's so bad about having, 2 degrees more in summer? That's not the whole story. One big aspect is that extreme weather events are becoming more common and also more drastic in their outcomes. That's one point. And then it can lead to such events here, floods. Droughts are the other side, and you can actually see the combination of both floods and droughts really nicely just around the corner here. Who recognizes this place on the right? Where is that? Exactly, I'm just repeating it now because you're not on the microphone. This is the Ogertal Dam, or the Ogertalsperre in German, the dam for the Oger just in the Harz region. And it's an extremely nice example. So I'm here now for 4 years as a professor, and I think it was 2 or 3 years ago where there was so little water in the dam that they, like you could see the old villages that they flooded you could essentially walk to these old villages and you could stumble up on the ruins of those buildings and touch them and smell them and do whatever you like to them. And just a year later, around Christmas, they had to do an emergency water release of the same dam because it was overflowing. It was reaching more than 100% of its capacity, so they had to release water no matter whether they wanted or not. So having a dry spell so that you're running out of water, followed by we have to start flooding the city just because otherwise our dam might bursting. So you have this very, very uneven distribution of resources that you need. And I probably don't really have to paint a picture here what that means, for example, for something like food security. It's nice if the average of precipitation, of rainfall, remains the same. But if that means I have 180 days without rain, and then suddenly one day where the rain worth of 180 days rains, I still don't have food, because this is not how most plants work that provide you calories. So not really good. That brings us essentially to the next topic, food, which I already scratched in the previous slide, and which is also one of our Now we're back with the microphone. Sorry for the interruption. That is just a shitty microphone. Food security, one of our research topics here. We're essentially trying to figure out ways how we can still provide a decent and healthy diet given all those issues that we're talking about. Like, we're now talking about climate change. We'll come to environmental pollution and resource scarcity later. But an environment that gets adverse and more adverse, not every day, but maybe every week or every month, makes it more difficult to grow sufficient amount of foods. So how can you still do that, given that the environment that we're currently living in doesn't really allow that anymore? And there are like varying other factors that come in. We're losing topsoil. We're using various places on this planet to like becoming deserts. So if you have 3 to 4 degrees global warming, what's now Spain, where a lot of our food comes from, will more look like Saudi Arabia or Dubai, and you probably don't even have to like really consider living in Dubai anymore if we hit 3-degree global warming in a place that is now barely livable without high-tech technology. And that also means that you have to produce more food in less space. Then you have this extra additional problems like long dry spells and then suddenly too much. So food security is something that we take for granted because we can just go to the supermarket, not 24/7 because we're not living in the US, but I don't know, 12, 14 hours a day. And there's always almost everything that you want. No one stops you from just eating all the junk food or the most freshest vegetable from all over the world at every goddamn day. So this is something that we're used to, but not really something we might have in the future. That's why we're like essentially looking into that, so that we do not run into that situation. What do you have, or what do you get if you have long dry spells? Wildfires. That's at least one of those potential problems. You also have extended soil erosion because dry soil just nicely flies away if you have wind. This is actually one image that we took from Australia, but we're also having more extended wildfires, once again, just outside our doors in the Harz region, that you have extended wildfire seasons, but also the effects of wildfires becoming more and more prominent the drier your area gets. Something that we are not so much impacted by here in the Harz region, but nonetheless in Germany, is a rising sea level. Rising temperatures causing glaciers to melt, not just in the mountains, but also at the North and the South Pole. Ice is melting. Melting ice has to go somewhere. The sea level is rising. And of course, it's only a few centimeters, millimeters by normal standards, but once again, it being exaggerated or multiplied in extreme weather situations. So even though if just, let's say, half a meter extra of seawater level, let's say you just get half a meter extra or 1 meter extra, if you're standing at the North Sea or the Baltic Sea, you're just like, yeah, okay, 1 meter, not that much, I'll just take a few steps back. But the problem is that when you have like extreme weather events like storms and other stuff, those 1 meter base level makes a much bigger difference in extreme situations. So you can, of course, try to mitigate this problem by just saying, okay, I build some kind of protection, and if the water rises, I build that protection a bit higher, and if we have more sea level, then I just keep building on top of this. Problem is, there are various restrictions to that approach. One is usually money. It's extremely expensive to do that for larger areas. Like you can protect smaller areas, you can even like put like a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 meter dam there to protect certain areas, but you rarely can do this for extended parts of a country. The Dutch people are trying really hard, and it will be an interesting story to witness whether they will continue to succeed in the long term, and they are already putting huge amounts of money into protecting their country as it is right now, not even accounting for significant amounts of sea level rises. And we would have to ask ourselves the same question. I mean, we have the North Sea and we have the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea might not be the main problem because it's a rather shallow sea or lake-like structure, but the North Sea being an actual problem. I mean, Hamburg might not be directly at the sea, but has a really, really easy access for a lot of water getting into Hamburg, and it's very much questionable up to which point you either have the financial resources or just the resources like plain and resources in terms of building materials to protect such a big area that like it's next to a river. You cannot just block the river at all times because water is coming from behind and then also pushing from the other side. So how can you protect such a big city with millions of people and trillions in infrastructure cost from those events? Just building higher, higher, higher has its limitation. It is not just a simple solution. And I said that essentially in the first org part, like what are you supposed to learn and understand here? Simple answer to rising sea level is, okay, I just build a dam, and if it gets higher, I build that dam higher. But usually it's not that simple. There are different aspects to consider. And I'm also just scratching the surface here. I'm just pointing out some of the issues that will be our problems in the future. What I'm slowly but surely building towards too is this new perspective that is probably quite healthy to adapt, that what we considered a catastrophe or an extreme weather event in the past is going to slowly but surely become the new normal, therefore making other things the new catastrophe of the future that people didn't even think about. And a very nice concept to explain that are those 100-year flood droughts or 10-year flood droughts, which are not just like a colloquial term, but those are actually like terms that they use in disaster prevention. Like a 100-year flood is a flood event that happens on average, statistically, once every 100 years, certain weather conditions get together. The problem with those extreme weather events becoming more common and more powerful due to climate change, as one of the consequences of climate change is that suddenly those 100-year floods start to occur every 50 years or even every 10 years. And of course, that also now creates then a new 100-year flood. So what was considered a once-in-a-lifetime experience now might become something that you experience every 10 years. In consequence also, the 10-year floods might now occur every year or every other year. And the same for droughts, rainfall events, high temperatures, and so on and so on. We'll get back to that in an extra specific lecture where we'll also look at the predictions for different types of global warming. So what would be the difference in extreme hot days for 1.5 degrees versus 3 degrees versus 4.5 degrees, for example? Like, how would that scale? What's the consequence of extreme weather events becoming the new normal? It will lead to parts of this world that we are now very comfortable living in becoming either very, very difficult to inhabit it or even uninhabitable. I already gave this like simple example. If we have 3 degrees global warming, you can essentially close all doors in Dubai and say, okay, that's it. We'll shut everything down and leave, because this is probably the consequence of this. It's very difficult already to sustain livable conditions in Dubai without major energy waste or energy consumption and a lot of high-tech stuff. Sure, like some people can still live there in very, very simplistic ways, but it's not a way to sustain a major economy or even a major nation state. So a lot of parts of the planet potentially become uninhabitable. What does that mean? We have a finite planet. Parts of this planet becoming uninhabitable means either we suddenly have a drastic drop in inhabitants, or we need to move more inhabitants to less square meters. So people are naturally moving where things are still okay-ish. That is quite natural. If you have a world war, you have the tendency to not go where the world war is. If there are mass famines, you go where still food is. Like, at least there is this tendency to do that. You might think of Greta Thunberg whatever you like, especially given her latest focus change in her adventures. But I think there is this quote from her still holds to be true, especially from two different perspectives. I think, like, at least the way I interpreted it back then when she said it, this change is coming whether you like it or not, more like a threat or a motivation to people in power that the youth and other people will enforce this change. But there's also a second meaning to that climate change is coming whether you like it or not, or climate change or environmental pollution related changes. It doesn't really matter if you believe in climate change or not. It's just going to be there at your door knocking. But this is more like a side note now. Good, so this far we talked about climate change as one of the major challenges. We only talked about some aspects of climate change as a motivational or demotivational part. We'll go into detail in the next 2 lectures. Next on our topic list is environmental pollution. I brought once again a few examples from further away, but we'll also have examples just outside this window in Goslar. So the first picture is from Greenland. Pristine nature, beautiful landscape, excellent air quality, but at least at that point, a lack of communal waste management. Because I've been there for like kayaking trips, and it's been a while. It's been 10 years at least now. And when we were there, we heard a truck reversing, this beep, beep, beep sound, and they just dumped a lot of waste. And I was quite sure that there is no dump site or waste site where he just emptied the whole truck, because I've just been standing there enjoying the view, and there was no waste or dump site there. They just put all of this into the fjord, or namely into the ocean, because if I can't see the waste anymore, it's not there anymore. So that is their waste disposal system, or was their waste disposal system there. Of course, there are less than 50,000 people on Greenland, so it's not as much waste as even like Braunschweig produces or Wolfenbüttel. But of course, you can't really do that without suffering the consequences at some point. The other picture on the right might also be familiar to you from news articles or documentaries, that we have a tendency to not just using stuff and then rather quickly throwing it away, but also a tendency as a rich country to export our waste problem, that we're sending it to Africa or Southeast Asia, where we make our waste other people's problem, where then people who are below or like in extreme poverty then are scavenging through our trash just to make a living by picking some valuable resources out of that trash and leaving the really unusable trash behind. But trash is just one dimension of environmental pollution. Fossil fuels, not just generating CO2 when you burn it, but there are also other environment polluting aspects of burning dead dinosaurs. Oil, most famous fossil fuel, coal, whether it's being black or brown, being another one. 3 of the 10 dirtiest European coal plants are located in Poland, which is extremely famous for having one of the dirtiest energy mixes in all of Europe. Any idea? You can't say anything. You know the answer. Where the other 7 dirtiest coal plants are located. I have to admit this was 2021, if I'm not mistaken, so it might have now slightly changed, but the answer is still quite interesting. Wild guesses. So one person says it's where Mate is, and Mate says it is here. And the answer, it is here, is correct. So despite all its promises and attempts, 7 of Germany and the German politicians, 7 of the 10 dirtiest coal plants are still located in Germany. I have to check the number if it still holds true in 25. But even in 2021, Germany was at least pretending to do quite a lot of things to have this green image, or at least like keeping people happy with the perceived progress towards sustainability, while mostly keeping it on a greenwashing level or some kind of will keep people happy level, and not really on a substantial level where you really do something. Another aspect of environmental pollution, but then, and now you can already see that some things are heavily interconnected, like climate change, is barren land. If I have long dry spells, land gets crumbly and dry, you have soil erosion, but you also lose a lot of nutrients. If you do the wrong type of agriculture, you get the same result, but also if you heavily rely on, or if you have heavy contamination using pollutants, or if you have heavy use of pesticides or herbicides, this type of barren land is also something that will become more and more common, that you essentially just have dead soil. And soil being completely dead with nothing inside is, I mean, you have to get rid of less weeds, but usually it also doesn't really help to grow a lot of food anymore. Another side effect of using pesticides, herbicides, but also environmental pollution in general, but also climate change is the occurrence of mass extinctions. We have roughly 8 million species on this planet, already including the roughly 5.5 million insect species. That sounds at first like quite a lot. We're not talking about like individuals, but just different species. So a few more or less shouldn't be a problem. But up to 1 million of those species are threatened with extinction within some decades. And you could then even still argue, okay, so we still have 7 million, so 1 million plus minus, not a big deal, but it is a complex ecosystem. One species depends on another. We often depend on various species, bees, and not just honeybees, but more importantly, wild bees, and a lot of insects are the main pollinators for a lot of the food that you eat and that you grow. Heavy use of pesticides and herbicides killing a lot of those insects then cause you to not have pollinated plants which do not bear fruits, which then might be a big problem for your supermarket experience. Yeah, just another statistic point here, more than 40% of amphibian species threatened with extinction, so not really a pleasant experience. Moving on to the third aspect that we'll look at a little bit closer, being resource scarcity, or the problem of not having a sufficient amount of resources. Because we have a finite planet, that means we have a set of finite resources. You cannot have unlimited resources on a finite planet. Where should those resources come from? So if you use something, then it's not there anymore. You might be able to recover something, but usually that's not the case. This figure is quite famous. It's a so-called Earth Overshoot Day. And the idea is that the planet has a set of resources, some of even them regenerating. For example, trees grow. If you harvest less timber, then the trees grow. Then over time, the forest regenerates. If you cut down more forest, then it can grow back, then you're losing forest. There's like this, I don't know if that was ever true or if it's just like a saying, but like for England, but also for Spain, there's a saying like in previous times, a chipmunk could, chipmunk? Yeah, I think chipmunks, they could jump from tree to tree and cross the whole land without touching the soil once, because there were so many trees in Spain or in England. Both of them very famously had a tendency to build large wooden ships and then crash those ships into each other and shooting small iron balls at each other to fight over who has, I don't know, the best god or who's the most powerful. That being one aspect, of course, industrial revolution that required a lot of energy and construction material also decimated large amounts of existing forests. Point being here, no matter whether the chipmunk example is true or not, if I use more wood than is regenerated within every year, then I have a deficit of resources. And I might be able to do that for a while, but at some point I'm running out of forest or wood in other terms. And you can apply that and abstract that to various types of resources. Some are renewable, others are not renewable, or at least not renewable on the time scale that we can care about, like oil. Could be considered renewable in a certain sense, but not in the timeline that is relevant to us. So you have a set of resources that you can use per year to keep yourself in this equilibrium. And the idea of this overshoot day is essentially to tell you when did you overshoot the amount of resources that you could use to keep in this equilibrium. And the bigger, the greener column, the better in terms of sustainability. So this is essentially, green is where we kept within the limits that we have to stay sustainable or to not overconsume our resources. Red means essentially this is where we crossed into overusing natural resources. So in the early 1970s, in 1971, we just had a few days in December where we essentially lived on credit. 1972 looked much better, but then afterwards it went pretty much downhill. So that we have in 2025, what is it, something like end of July? That means August, September, October, November, December, 5 months. After 7 months, we have used the resource budget for the whole year. In the next 5 months, we're living on credit. Let that sink in from your own financial budgeting perspective. If you ran out of money in July and the rest of the year you're just living on credit of money that you might earn next year, and then you do that again the year after and again, it's very simple to explain that this is not a viable option to pretty much everyone. But we're still doing this and no one really cares. So essentially compounding effects that will bite us in the ass very, very soon. So if everyone would live like us, we would need something like 1.8 planets. Unfortunate truth is we only have one planet, and to come back to the beginning of the lecture, we're ruining it right now. There's actually this really nice, I think I do not have this in this lecture slide, but in a different set, there's like you can even explain this to a toddler. You have these nice boxes filled with sand for like small children and toddlers to play them, where they can build like small sand castles and so on, like play and dig holes. If you throw sand out left and right and shit and pee in the corners of your sandbox, it's gonna be uninhabitable and you might not like to be there. So even a child of 2 or 3 years might understand that concept. However, we're somehow struggling to make this concept understandable to grown-up people who claim to be quite smart. Anyway, that's just like a side note. What happens if you have an uneven distribution or even a lack of resources? For some resources, you might just be able to substitute them. Or you come to the conclusion that you might, like chocolate might be nice, but you don't need chocolate to survive. I know it's a arguable position, whether you need or do not need chocolate to survive, but you get the point. Like something you might be able to substitute, something might not be vital to live, but it's not the first conflict that you have over vital resources like water, for example. There have already been armed conflicts fighting over water. If you have more extreme weather events, especially areas that are already prone to having water availability problems, like north of Africa, or could probably take bigger chunks of Africa, or desert parts of this world, this will become a more conflict-rich situation. And if you abstract that to not just to from water to resources in general, there is of course a very high chance that resource scarcity will lead to wars over remaining resources. India and Pakistan and China, like this combination being another great example. Pakistan usually being in the situation of not being on the lucky end of things, because they are more downhill than India and China, building dams holding back water that Pakistan needs to survive. If they somehow mess up the remaining relationship that they have with any of those partners, they're running out of water. So these three have, I think China has this conflict with India, India with Pakistan, and Pakistan, I think, with both. They're somewhere in this boat together all the time, essentially, where one fucks with the other. You also have similar examples in Africa, where one is building a dam holding back the water for others, claiming we're gonna be responsible, and of course, we're gonna share that water. But as soon as you run out of water, you're probably gonna first take care of your own citizens instead of caring about those downstream. You get the idea. So if resources are scarce, people will have conflicts over them. Conflict can just be shouting arguments. Conflicts can also be throwing bombs at each other and shooting each other. There's this really nice quote that I think a lot of people don't really like to think about, especially our generation. I know I'm probably 10, 15 years older than you, but I'm still counting me rather to your generation than the 15 years older people than me. That our parents and your parents have this, they're probably just gonna die of old age, because they are still living in a rather stable environment with a working healthcare system. But if you have this constant availability of extreme weather events, of global warming, of potential conflicts over resources, 3 degrees as a potential threshold for society starting to crumble, This illusion of you just having the same opportunity is just an illusion. There is a quite high chance, no matter whether you belong to the upper class of billionaires or if you're living in a rather good situated country like Germany, you still will suffer from the consequences of climate change and all the related after effects of environmental pollution and resource scarcity. It might hit you later, but it would be very neglectful to just assume this is not a problem that I will have. This is your future. You're probably not just going to die of old age, you're rather going to die of some of the side effects of those problems that we're talking about. And if any one of you has the idea of getting children, please take that into account and find a way to somehow get that in line with the actions that you're taking. So, summarizing that, 3 key challenges, not exclusively only those key challenges that exist on this planet, but summarizing some of the 3 that we definitely need to tackle to somehow make it through the 21st century. It's on one hand climate change, so preventing climate change from getting worse and worse, but also of course adapting to the portion of climate change that we cannot reverse anymore. Same for environmental pollution, preventing further environmental pollution, but also adapting to environmental pollution that has already been caused and reversing environmental pollution. And just because I forgot the example of environmental pollution just outside this window, the Harz region is a very famous old mining area. I've been like digging up stuff here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I'm not a mining expert. And just on the other side of this hill is one of the oldest mining facilities in Europe, the Rammelsberg. You can go there and see like the old mining operations there and so on and so on. This also means that all the environmental pollution that mining operations usually cause also has been like somehow nicely spread around this area for several hundred years now. Of course, earlier, when just 2 or 3 peoples were digging in the rubbles of the Harz mountain region, that didn't really cause that much environmental pollution. But at least with the start of the Industrial Revolution and starting to mine like huge amounts of interesting materials and minerals here, the pollution started to skyrocket. On one hand, the stuff that they dug up there, but also the materials, chemicals that they used to then separate various materials from each other. And right now, in this very place that we're having this lecture, there are no green trash bins. Those that you usually use for your bio waste, where you can put like your grass cuttings in there or whatever you have left when you're done eating or when you peel your potatoes. There are no green trash bins here because the area here is so highly contaminated that even your grass cuttings are considered waste, that like special waste essentially. It's hazardous waste what grows in your garden. Of course you can grow a potato here and you can also eat it and it might actually taste, but it's definitely not going to extend your lifetime. So this area here is so polluted that you cannot use stuff that grows in your garden. You have to put it into special waste bins. And that extends over the whole area here. So when I'm walking my dogs, I'm going to this small airplane field, like 2 or 3 car minutes away from here. And there's a lot of, like depending on how much rain falls, there's a lot of water running off the mountains, and there's like a special lake where they collect that water to let like all the bad materials sink down or like collect them, then they can easily scratch them up. Depending on what type of weather and what like is heavy rain season or whatever, the water looks very different in color. Sometimes it's shiny, sometimes it's red, sometimes it's more like an orange tone. That also probably tells you that this is not the water that you want to drink. And a lot of this water ending up in the Oka going to Braunschweig, so it's not a regional problem that you just say, okay, this one place here is fucked. It essentially goes wherever this water is flowing. You can drink, after heavy processing, the water of the Oka. For example, in Braunschweig, they use parts of the Oka water to make drinking water. But if you, for example, dig in the sediments of the Oka, maybe don't do that too much, because all this heavy stuff is just sinking down and accumulating there. And it's also not quite as easy to just dig it out, because then you have this hazardous waste, and then you have to put it in special landfills that are quite expensive, and no one really wants them. So they just leave it in there, hoping that it doesn't do too much harm. So just one example that environmental pollution is not just something that happens far away where we export our waste, it's also happening here. And it also impacts our food production. There are fields just right around the corner. What is the solution to make flour as heavily contaminated wheat? You just mix it with a sufficient amount of uncontaminated wheat until you get below the threshold that is considered dangerous for your health. This is how you get your food. I hope you enjoy your bread later tonight. Good. I just wanted to add a small example in terms of environmental pollution. Third problem that we're talking about, running out of resources. Some resources, as we said, are regenerable or renewable. Others are just finite by definition, or at least finite in a time span that is relevant for us. So, as I already promised you, this was quite demotivating, but I hope it motivated the topic and clarified the relevance, not just for you as part of the study program, but also for your future. A question that I'm often getting when we're having this discussion about some of those problems, of course not in this extent, but also in a more shallow experience, is this still a problem? Because there are supposedly a lot of solutions to tackle various aspects of these problem. And usually the answer is yes, of course, because it's not quite that simple. Battery electric vehicles, supposedly the future of transportation to make sure that we're not burning any dead dinosaurs anymore. And I'm not going to argue that, and we'll also dig into that when we're looking into life cycle assessments, whether it's actually more sustainable to drive a battery electric vehicle versus a combustion engine vehicle. Like, we'll look into the actual numbers of that in later sessions. And yes, it is more sustainable to drive a battery electric vehicle under most conditions. But it's not the solution to our problems, or at least not at the scale that we have. Because it's not like those electric vehicles are substituting one by one a combustion engine car. We're just keeping the number of cars stable. It's still increasing, so we're still topping those cars on top of our existing mess. Sure, some of them are substituting other cars, but in general, we're still getting more and more cars, meaning more and more resource consumption, meaning more and more environmental pollution while producing those cars, more and more resources being gone, more and more energy being released, which usually then contributes to climate change. So instead of substituting one by one, it's just one way to add to it. And there's this nice saying, the battery electric vehicle is not saving our planet, it's just saving the car industry. And I'd say at least it's partially true. Same about substituting plastic stuff with more biodegradable options. That is not a bad problem. It's not a bad solution in itself. It's just not going to be the solution on large scale. You can substitute as many plastic forks as you like, but you're not going to save the planet with that. That said, please try to avoid plastic forks. I'm not encouraging you to use one-time use shit just because it's convenient. Also, just planting one tree after another is not going to save us. We'll also get back to that in the LCA lecture, but essentially to offsetting meaning to compensate for the CO2 that we're emitting. Like, the idea is like, okay, we're emitting this amount of CO2, I'm just going to plant a tree so that I can afford my New York trip, and then everything will be fine. Just to offset all of this, we would be like in need of multiple planets just to plant enough trees, not even considering the fact that we need to grow some food there and live somewhere. So that's also not a solution. I'm not, once again, saying that it's bad to plant a tree. Every tree that is still here is better than a tree being gone. But also that option just doesn't scale and solve our problems. Recycling being the same thing. We'll dive deeper into that within the circular economy section. It is good if you recycle, because then we can make use of or reuse of certain resources that otherwise might be lost. That helps to mitigate the problem of resource scarcity. However, just recycling everything is not the solution, because recycling in itself is a very energy-expensive process, and usually you have a lot of quality losses, but we'll get back to that in a second. And there will be one slide that I'm always getting back and back and back 2. That's not here. So I'm just gonna briefly touch on this. Because all of this is fine, but what would be way more efficient? Like, what is more efficient than buying a battery electric vehicle? What is more efficient than substituting a plastic fork with a wooden spoon or with a wooden fork? Or more sustainable than planting a tree or recycling the stuff that you just bought and are now throwing away? It's not just consuming that in the first place. If we can somehow reduce the amount of cars, it's way more sustainable and way more helpful in terms of those major problem categories that we just discussed than having any of those solutions. If I can avoid any kind of one-time use stuff in the first place, I don't have to think about wooden substitutes or any other like pseudo-biodegradable plastic shit. Those are only substitutes for problems, or like pseudo-problem-solving substitutes. Not consuming in the first place is the most sustainable thing you can do. Then I also don't have to offset it by planting a tree, and I don't have to recycle a product that I did not even consume in the first place. That is usually way more sustainable. We'll get back to that probably 100 times or so. Yeah. Coming back to the major depressing part of this lecture series, if that somehow makes you feel sad or asking yourself like, okay, if it's so pointless, what am I even doing here? Then you are not really alone. There is a nice quote from a scientist called Kate Marvel. She is, if I'm not mistaken, she's a NASA scientist with the Goddard Institute, if I'm not mistaken. And she's like often at conferences giving talks. You can also find her on YouTube. She's like quite good at speaking and illustrating difficult problems or difficult, complex situations in simple, easy, understandable words. And she provided this quite longer statement. It's multiple pages, so we'll go through this one by one. As a climate scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope, particularly in the current political climate. Audiences want to be told that everything will be all right in the end. I guess you can all agree. Would be nice if you say, look, there's a problem, but it will be fine. We'll find solutions to that. Climate change is bleak, the organizers always say. Tell us a happy story. Give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. We're inevitably sending our children to live on an unfair and unfamiliar planet. But the opposite of hope is not despair. It is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. And here, the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together. The swiftness of the change, its scale and inevitability binds us into one broken heart trapped together under a warming atmosphere. What we need is not really hope, according to her, but rather courage. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. And as the husband to a psychologist, I can also tell you what really helps, according to scientific studies, if you are extremely despaired or if you're experiencing hardship, is to do something, no matter what the outcome is. But having this opportunity, this option, this just small hope that doing something will do something. Just sitting depressed in the corner or in your room and just assuming that everything will turn to shit because this is what you're told, sure, that will ensure that we're definitely gonna get there. But doing something leaves the option of a positive outcome. So, point being from this long quote, shitty situation, you can either accept it and say, okay, I'm just gonna enjoy the few years, decades that we have left and make the most of it, or I will do something to prevent it instead of just ignoring it and hoping for the best. One of the major reasons why a lot of people don't decide to do something is this perception of, okay, if I just do something that really doesn't make a dent, like we're 8 billion people on this planet, what's the point of Germany switching to green energy if China is still burning more coal than, 20 other countries together? And so on and so on. Or if only I You have to tell me if there's something important in the chat, Chintan. Okay, good, excellent, good. So essentially this point, like, okay, if I just do something, it doesn't really matter, and we cannot really do something if we have not billions on our side. Everything else is pointless, so I'm just not going to do anything in the first place. And there's actual research in this direction from the social perspective, but also from the anthropological perspective. What percentage of the population needs to participate in peaceful protest or civilian disobedience for political change? That could be like voting rights for women, or not being a slave colony to the UK anymore, or to any other colonial power, or, for example, to saving our planet. What would be your estimates without having looked at the next slides or already knowing the answer, because having heard asked the same question before? Taking guesses from the audience. I will point fingers if you don't raise your hands yourself. 5%? Someone more, someone less? 4%? Is someone offering more or less than 4%? 3%? Why are you not all out on the street if you just think it's 3, 4, or 5%? You should be gluing yourself to the street right now, demanding change. Because usually the answer is like either you have very good intuition. What are we getting from the online people?
60% more than 20% and 40% is less than 5%. And total of 5 votes. Out of 5 votes, less than 5 is none of mine. So
because you know the answer. Good, so the online votes are more representative of what we usually get, that most people have the perception like it has to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% to really make a difference. Either you already all have, like the offline audience has a very good intuition or like a very good understanding, or they might have looked at the other slide to get to the conclusion that it's actually not that much. That if you look at various peaceful protest movement in the past that fought for various changes of societal structures in the past, then the average is that something like 3.5% usually works. So you don't need that many people to be actively arguing in favor of change. Most people are passive anyway. That's like why it works very well to get to shift societies from one extreme to another. You need a lot of people shouting loud enough. Like this is why it's quite easy to get a shift towards the right if you just have enough media publicity on the right. Similarly, it will also work in other directions for extremists. But just because you're shouting the loudest doesn't really mean that you have like also the majority in terms of population. So you actually don't need that much power to shift the society. And it might not just be that you have to like fight for it against the law or against all odds. There's actually also support from the legal side. Because at least in Germany, you also have some fundamental rights that you get by just being born here or by living here. So basic law for the Federal Republic of Germany, or just in German, the Grundgesetz, gives you various rights. One of them, Article 20a, is the protection of the natural foundations of life and animals. And there it says, like you can also get the German one below, but in English it is mindful also of its responsibilities towards future generations. The state shall protect the natural foundations of life and animals by legislation and in accordance with law and justice, by executive and judicial action, all within the framework of the constitutional order. Long story short, the state has the obligation to ensure that you have a future worth living, and the same is true for your children. You have a right to that, and if the state does not ensure that this right is given to you, then you can sue them. And this is actually, I think there's a slide missing. Yeah, there's a slide missing because actually some people from this Friday for Future space, but also related organizations actually sued the government, and they won because Germany is not doing enough. Like, we're promising a lot of stuff, but then we are usually rather bad at going through with the promises that we made. We're not the worst country in that respect, but we're definitely not keeping up with the promises that we made. It's also quite nice that Hamburg now decided that they have to, like, they had a popular vote, and majority of Hamburg decided, yep, we want to be climate neutral by 2040 instead of 2050 now, or something. Like, they shifted it somehow forward 5 or 10 years. It's great that they made this decision, but now they also have to make it happen. And this is usually like this big problem, that you can promise something or have great ambitions. You might know that when, like, from your preparations for exams, or the great glorious goal of not procrastinating this exercise submission until the very last moment and rather do it right after the lecture. You have a lot of ambitions there. Often there's a difference between your ambition and then your actual submission deadline, when you actually submit your homework, or when you start really preparing for the exam, or how well you're actually studying throughout a day. Yes, I will study 10 hours today and not watch 8 hours of Netflix and then study maybe 2 hours out of a bad conscience. So area of conflict, let's say it like this. You have the right for your future worth living, but you also have to defend that right and ask for it, and essentially make sure that you get it. So after all these demoting factors, just these like 2 minor beacons of hope at the horizon. So what is this course all about? We're closing in on the end. This was a very long demotivating motivation and teaser for why this is relevant and why you should care. We'll in particular look at those 3 key challenges of the 21st century. Those are not the only key challenges that we have in this century, but they are definitely among the most important, because if we don't figure those out, then we can close the shop and just call it a day. So we'll look at climate change, adaptation to climate change, environmental pollution and adaptation to pollution, dwindling non-renewable resources, and so on and so on. This is going to be the base part. So we'll look at those problems in particular. We'll also talk about the foundations of various terms there, and then the circular economy. And then, as I promised, afterwards we'll later look at different building blocks that hopefully can help us to address those problems or those challenges. This course, as you already might have noticed on the way I present those problems and try to engage with you, is also supposed to make you want to act, and you becoming aware that if you do not something, there is little chance that other people are taking this task away from you and still making sure that you have a future worth living. So you should do something about it. This is not a course about what should other people do. This is a course about what you should and need to do. At the end, you should have this understanding of causes, dimension, and characterization of those 3 key challenges that we briefly touched upon in this section now. You should also be able to critically assess available solutions and put them into perspective. Like, yes, a battery electric vehicle might buy us some time, might help us with respect to certain aspects, but not having need for individual transportation in the first place would be more sustainable, though. Those kind of assessment and understandings. And also you should be acting before it's too late. This course, as I briefly teasered in the organization slide, is part of this larger research agenda, of this larger research profile of TU Clausthal, of Clausthal University of Technology. The main research theme is the circular economy, but mostly from an engineering perspective. So how can engineers, being it chemistry people or engineering people, so material science, mining engineers, or so on and so on, how can they help to make the circular economy happen? And we are essentially now laying the groundwork in terms of knowledge for those different fields of expertise. This is also why this course is literally open to anyone, being a bachelor, master, or PhD student from every study programs. We even had people who are not even enrolled at any university and participated in this course, and those people are also welcome, because this is a foundation to then help you to understand more complex stuff in a special field. For most of you, probably digital technologies and computer science, but as I said, like, this course is not specifically tailored toward computer science or any digital or engineering areas. I might be a computer scientist myself, but I rather see this as a limitation than anything that should, like, put this course in a certain direction. What this course is not, as you might have guessed after this first lecture, it's not a everything will be fine lecture. It is also not a business as usual is sufficient, that if we just continue, we'll at some point figure it out. And this is also not a lecture that just tells you to substitute plastic forks with wooden forks and then everything will be fine. It's also not a soothing high-definition TikTok video that you just watch because someone told you that they planted 5,000 trees and now everything will be fine. And it's also not a place to discuss whether climate change is real or not, because overwhelming amount of research indicate it is, and I would leave it at that point, because we have more important topics to discuss later on. What is it course supposed to teach you on an abstract level? It's supposed to help you to develop a strategy, because a strategy is turning resources that you have into the power you need to get what you want, your goal. It's not my quote, it's from someone smarter than me called Marshall Gantz. So, strategic goal, what do you want? You hopefully want to have a future worth living. The goal is a clear, measurable point that allows you to know if you won or lost, and that meets the challenge your constituency faces. So, strategic goal, what do you want given the challenges that we have there? Power, what you need. Tactics through which you can turn your resources into a capacity you need to achieve your goal. So what are things you can do to have a future worth living and not dying a horrible death? What are different strategies? What are building blocks of a solution? This is partially what you learn here. As I said, I'm not claiming that what we're trying to teach you is the solution. At best, those are potential building blocks. And resources. Time, money, skill, relationships, etc. So we're mostly providing you with skills and potentially maybe a little bit of relationships here. Money and time is unfortunately not something I can offer at greater scale, so you have to somehow acquire that somewhere else. But these are also just examples. You don't necessarily need money and time. So that's it. Some additional resources that you will find at the end of all of our lectures. Here it's just the Chenoweth study or the Chenoweth book where this 3.5% came from. If you're more interested in that in detail, you can look her up. And that's it for today's lecture. We will now cut the recording again. For everyone who's not in the live stream right now or in the lecture room, see you again next week, same place, same time. The same time, same place, and we'll do a 15-minute break now. Let's make it a 10-minute break now because I'm quite late. Then we'll have the opportunity to ask all types of questions. Shintan will elaborate a little bit on the exercises, and then you are free to go. Won't take much longer than, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. So you have survived the worst now. Thank you all very much, and all the best.